I never imagined betrayal could sound so calm. No shouting, no argument, just those 7 words. "It's time you moved out, Mom." He said it like a man asking for the salt at dinner, like it was something ordinary. But for me, it was the sound of the floor giving way beneath my feet. It happened on a Sunday. I remember because I'd made his favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes, the kind his father used to make when he was little. The smell filled the house, that same house where every corner still whispered the memory of his childhood laughter. I thought it was going to be another quiet morning. Instead, it became the day I learned how easily love can be rewritten. His wife, Claire, stood behind him with that polite smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Her perfume, vanilla and something sharp, filled the room. Even now, that scent makes my stomach tighten. I didn't cry. Not then. I simply nodded, my hands still sticky from the syrup, and asked if they were sure. They were. I remember the silence after they left the kitchen. Ticking of the clock. The way the sunlight hit the counter where his father once carved our initials when we first bought the place. The air felt too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. That's the thing about betrayal, it never begins with fire. It begins with stillness. Later that afternoon, I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, the furniture, the memories. Every photo frame felt heavier than it looked. I stopped at the hallway mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her eyes looked tired, older somehow, though I knew she was the same woman who once carried a toddler through this very hall, laughing as he tugged at her hair. I thought I'd built something permanent, a home, a family, a sense of belonging. But permanence is an illusion. Even the strongest walls can crumble when love forgets its foundation. That evening, I packed a small suitcase. Just clothes and a few keepsakes, my wedding ring, the watch my husband gave me on our 20th anniversary, a photo of Daniel as a boy holding a seashell to his ear. Everything else I left behind. I could hear them upstairs, talking about furniture, about how the guest room could finally be turned into Claire's office. Their voices were muffled, but each word carved into me like glass. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. Sometimes silence is the loudest thing a person can say. When I stepped outside that night, the air was cool and the sky was bruised purple with the setting sun. I turned to look at the house one last time, the windows glowing softly like old eyes watching me go. I whispered goodbye, not to them but to the life I thought would never end. I found a small motel near the edge of town, kind with flickering signs and paper-thin walls. The woman at the desk didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. I just wanted a place to breathe without feeling like an intruder in my own story. That night, as I lay awake listening to the hum of traffic outside, I thought of my husband. How proud he'd been when we bought that house. He'd worked overtime, saved every penny, said he wanted our son to have roots that went deep. I could almost hear his voice saying, "We build for them, Mary, so they'll always have a place to come home to." But somewhere along the years, those roots turned into chains, not for my son, but for me. I tried to close my eyes, but the memory of Daniel's voice kept replaying. The words weren't angry, that was what hurt the most. They were cold, final, detached, like he'd been rehearsing them for days. I thought of the little boy who once refused to sleep unless I sat beside him and hummed. The boy who cried when he scraped his knee, who promised he'd always take care of me when I was old. Where had he gone? Maybe love doesn't disappear all at once. Maybe it just fades until one day you realize it's gone, like a photograph left too long in the sun. I woke up before dawn and sat by the window, watching the light creep across the floor. Something inside me shifted that morning. Not anger. Not revenge. Something quieter, resolve. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. I still had the keys to the house. My name might not have been on his lips anymore, but I knew it was still written somewhere. Maybe in the dust, maybe in the deeds, maybe in the past. I didn't know what power I still held. But I was going to find out. Before leaving the motel, I took my wedding ring from my pocket. The gold had dulled over the years, but when I held it up to the light, it caught a faint glimmer, stubborn like memory itself. It reminded me of something my husband once told me after his first big case in court. He said, "The truth doesn't shout, Mary. It waits. And when the time is right, it walks in without knocking." I didn't understand it then. But that morning I finally did. 'Cause somewhere beneath the ache and humiliation, I felt something awakening, something patient, deliberate, and calm. I didn't need to fight. I didn't need to scream. I just needed to wait. By the time the sun fully rose, I had made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't seek revenge. I would seek balance. And if the world had decided to tip against me, I would find a way to make it even again. That day, I went back to the house, not to confront them, but to look, to remember, to think. From the street, it looked smaller than I remembered. Paint was fading, the flowers I'd planted were wilting. Funny how things fall apart so fast when love stops tending to them. As I stood there, a neighbor passed by and asked if I was visiting family. I just smiled and said something like that. 'Cause that's the thing about endings, they often look like beginnings in disguise. That night, I checked into a small rental apartment, no more than 2 rooms, quiet and clean. I unpacked my few things, placed the photo of my husband on the nightstand, and lit a candle. The flame flickered softly, steady but small, much like the hope inside me. And as I sat there, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of life beyond these walls, I whispered to myself, not a plan, not a threat, just a truth I finally believed. They may think they took everything, but they haven't seen what I still have left. And with that, I closed my eyes and let the silence settle around me like armor. 'Cause I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the calm before the storm. The days that followed were a blur of stillness and noise. Stillness inside me, noise outside. I tried to adjust to the silence of my new apartment, but silence can be a cruel companion. It forces you to listen, not to the world but to the echoes of what used to be. Every morning I would make coffee just the way I used to at home, 2 spoons of sugar, a dash of cinnamon. The smell would fill the tiny kitchen, and for a brief moment I could pretend nothing had changed. But then I'd reach for a second cup, the one I used to pour for Daniel, and my hand would stop midair. Habit can be heartbreak's cruelest ghost. Sometimes I wondered when exactly the distance began, the slow unraveling that turned warmth into coldness, gratitude into resentment. Maybe it started the day he met Claire. Or maybe it began long before that, in all the ways I tried to make his life easier, thinking I was protecting him when I was really teaching him to forget how to stand on his own. I used to believe that love meant giving everything without question. I didn't realize that when you give too much, people stop seeing it as kindness. They start seeing it as their right. When Daniel married Claire, I was happy for him, truly. She was beautiful, polished, confident. The kind of woman who spoke softly but carried her control like perfume. You didn't see it, you just felt it linger. First, she was kind. She'd bring me flowers, ask for recipes, call me Mom. But her kindness always came with an aftertaste, too sweet, too careful, like it was meant to be remembered later. Then came the small changes. She started helping me manage the bills, said it was easier to have everything digital. She offered to handle the mail, so you don't have to worry about it. She moved some of my furniture to make space for their new life. I told myself it didn't matter. That young people have their ways. That maybe I was just being sensitive. But every time something of mine disappeared, a piece of me went with it, quietly, without protest. There was a morning, I remember it so clearly, when I walked into the living room and saw that she had taken down the photo of Daniel's father. In its place was a framed quote about fresh starts. I asked her about it, and she said she thought it was time to make the house feel more like them. That's when I first felt it, the invisible push. Not enough to fall, but enough to make you stumble. I started spending more time in my room. I told myself I didn't want to interfere. But the truth is, I didn't know where I fit anymore. The home I built had become a museum of someone else's dreams. Daniel changed too. His laughter faded, replaced by a kind of cautious quiet. He was always checking his phone, always distracted, always caught between love and guilt. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to make everyone happy, but Claire's happiness came at a price. I didn't blame him at first. Love can make fools out of the best of us. But what hurt most was how easily he started believing her version of me, the one who was needy, controlling, in the way. There was one evening when I overheard them in the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen, but voices carry in that house. Claire was talking about retirement communities, saying how they'd give me companionship. Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, hands folded in my lap, and whispered to the dark, "I've become a problem to solve." And once you become a problem in your own child's eyes, love starts to rot. But here's the thing about silence, it remembers everything. Every slight, every word, every moment you swallow instead of speak. And one day it gives it all back to you, not in anger but in truth. One afternoon after I'd moved out, I went to the park. The same park where I used to take Daniel when he was little. The air smelled of grass and distant rain. Children were running across the playground, their laughter sharp and bright. I sat on a bench and watched them, feeling that ache of memory, the one that makes you smile and ache at the same time. I thought of the little boy who once clung to my hand, who begged me to push him higher on the swing. The one who used to say, "Don't let go, Mom." And now, years later, he'd said the opposite. "It's time you moved out." Funny how life circles back on itself. One day you're holding them up. The next, they're the ones letting you fall. That night, as I sat in my new apartment, I decided to unpack the last box. It was filled with papers, old files, things my husband used to keep locked in his desk. I hadn't looked through them since the funeral. As I sorted through yellowed receipts and faded photographs, my fingers brushed against a thick envelope sealed with wax. It had my name on it, written in his handwriting. I froze. My heart started to pound, not fast but deep like a slow drum. I opened it carefully, and inside was a folded letter and a set of documents. The letter was dated 12 years ago. He had written it long before he passed. The words were simple, but they changed everything. He wrote that he had made sure I would always be protected, that no matter what happened, the house would remain in my name. He said he knew how people change, how greed can disguise itself as family. And he didn't want me to ever feel powerless in the home we built together. I sat there for a long time just staring at those papers. My hands trembled, not from fear but from the weight of truth. All this time I thought I had nothing. But I still held everything. The house, the land, even the savings, all in my name. My husband had never changed the deeds, even after Daniel married. He kept it secret, maybe to protect me, maybe because he knew one day I'd need that protection. A strange calm came over me. Not the calm of peace, the calm before a decision. I folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the envelope, and set it on the table beside me. Then I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, listening to the sound of my own breathing. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt awake. Sometimes life gives you justice not through others, but through the patience of your own endurance. And that night I realized I didn't need to fight for a place in their home, 'cause the home had always been mine. I didn't sleep that night. The letter lay beside me, its words echoing louder than any dream. I kept reading the same line over and over, the one where my husband wrote, "If you ever find yourself unwelcomed in your own home, remember, you are not the guest." I could almost hear his voice saying it. Gentle, patient, certain. The way he always was when he spoke of truth. The sun was rising by the time I folded the letter for the last time and slipped it back into the envelope. The light spilled through the curtains, soft and gold, like forgiveness I didn't deserve yet. Strange how one discovery can shift everything you thought you knew about yourself. The day before, I was a burden. By morning, I was the owner. But power doesn't come with joy, not when it arrives through heartbreak. I made tea and sat by the window, watching the city wake up. Cars passing, birds darting between wires, the slow rhythm of a world that doesn't stop for anyone's pain. I thought of Daniel. And for the first time since he told me to leave, I felt something different. Not sorrow, not anger, just distance. Kind of distance you can't measure in miles, only in years of misunderstanding. I remembered his wedding day. He was so handsome in his navy suit, trembling slightly as he waited for Claire to walk down the aisle. He'd looked at me then the way sons are supposed to, with pride, with love. I had thought I'd done everything right. Raised him well, taught him kindness, taught him to value people more than things. But somewhere along the way, the world taught him different lessons, lessons that glittered more than they glowed. As I stared at the documents, my hands resting on the cool table surface, I realized something that cut deeper than betrayal. My son didn't just forget where he came from. He forgot who he came from. I spent the next few days in a haze of quiet reflection. Every corner of that small apartment became a witness to my thoughts. The couch where I sat tracing the edges of the deed, the kitchen counter where I whispered my late husband's name under my breath, the window through which I watched the leaves begin to turn. Autumn had arrived, the season of endings disguised as beauty. The air smelled faintly of rain and wood smoke. Somewhere nearby, a child was laughing, and for a moment it almost sounded like Daniel. The sound pierced through me, sharp and uninvited, and I pressed my hand to my chest as if to stop it from hurting. The memories came then, unfiltered and cruel. The scraped knees. The bedtime stories. The first day of school when he turned back to wave. Teenage years full of slammed doors and silent dinners. The man who kissed my cheek at graduation and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Mom." He did for a while. Until pride turned into possession. The betrayal didn't happen when he asked me to leave. It began long before, when he stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as something to manage, an old file in the cabinet of his life. Maybe that's the hardest part of growing old. Not the loneliness, not the quiet, but realizing how invisible you've become to the very ones you raised to see you. That realization broke me more than the letter ever could. I remember crying for the first time that week. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Just a few tears that slipped down quietly, like they had been waiting for permission. But once they started, they didn't stop. It wasn't just grief for my son. It was grief for all the versions of myself I'd lost trying to be his mother. The woman who gave up her career. The one who stayed up through the night sewing costumes for his school plays. The one who smiled through birthdays even when money was tight. The one who believed love was enough. Each tear felt like goodbye to her. When the crying stopped, something else settled in its place, stillness. Not the empty kind. Kind that follows a decision. I didn't know what I would do yet, but I knew this. I couldn't go back to being invisible. I folded the deed neatly and tucked it into a folder. I placed it inside a small metal box, the same kind my husband once used to keep his legal papers. Then I locked it and slid it under my bed. That night I wrote in my journal, something I hadn't done in years. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. I spent my whole life giving. Maybe now it's time to remember what I kept. I closed the journal, exhaled, and turned off the light. Sleep came easily for the first time in weeks. 'Cause the truth has a way of quieting even the loudest pain. The next morning, I decided to visit the house. I told myself it was just to see it one last time, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The drive felt longer than it was. Every mile was a memory. Every turn was a reminder. When I arrived, the driveway was lined with fallen leaves. Curtains were new, white and stiff, like the house was pretending to be something it wasn't. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, just watching. Through the window, I saw Claire arranging flowers in a vase. She moved like she owned the world. And maybe, for now, she thought she did. Daniel wasn't home. His car was gone. I wanted to hate her, but all I felt was pity. 'Cause there's something hollow about people who think love is measured in control. They don't understand that real power isn't about possession. It's about peace. I stayed there for nearly an hour. When I finally drove away, I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity. And clarity is what happens when heartbreak finishes its work. That night, I took the documents out again and read every line carefully. My husband's signature. The date. The notary stamp. My name, written clearly, legally, undeniably. The house was mine. It had always been mine. I thought of how easily Daniel and Claire had asked me to leave, how little they must have known about the ground they were standing on. They thought they were pushing me out of their lives. But really, they were standing in the palm of my hand. And that realization didn't make me vengeful. It made me sad. Sad that the only way I could protect my peace was by reclaiming what was already mine. I placed the papers back in the envelope, sealed it again, and whispered into the quiet. I forgive you, but I won't forget you. 'Cause forgiveness doesn't mean returning what was taken. It means remembering who you were before you were broken. And that night, as the city lights flickered outside my window, I realized something even deeper, something I hadn't dared to admit until then. I didn't miss my house. I missed being loved inside it. And since that wasn't something I could buy or beg for, I knew what had to come next. Not revenge. Restoration. The day I decided to act didn't feel like a decision at all. It was quiet. Soft. The kind of morning that pretends to be ordinary. There was no thunder, no voice from heaven telling me it was time. Just sunlight spilling through thin curtains and the smell of coffee. But that's how most turning points arrive, gently. They don't knock. They just appear, and before you realize it, your heart is already standing up. I sat at the small table in my apartment, the one by the window where I could see a strip of sky between the buildings. The folder sat in front of me, the deed, the letter, the proof. For days I had turned those pages over like prayer beads, waiting for anger to harden into purpose. But it never did. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about setting things back where they belonged. When my husband was alive, he used to say that justice doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears patience. And for years I thought patience was my weakness. That day I realized it was my weapon. So I made a call. The man who answered had a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 20 years, Robert Gaines, my husband's old friend and lawyer. Time had roughened his tone, but there was still that trace of kindness. When I told him who I was, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said softly, "I was wondering when you'd need me." We met the next afternoon in his office, a small place above a hardware store, filled with dust and memory. He still kept the same mahogany desk, scratched at the corners, and a photo of his wife who'd passed before mine. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer more than I needed to. I handed him the envelope, and he read through the papers with a slow, careful eye. When he finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "Mary," he said, "you have every right. More than they'll ever know." His words didn't make me proud. They made me tired. Because sometimes being right doesn't feel like victory, it feels like confirmation of something you wish wasn't true. We talked for a long time about what could be done, how it should be handled. I told him I didn't want drama or confrontation. I just wanted closure. He nodded and said, "Then let's do this quietly." And that's exactly what we did. Over the next few weeks, I met with buyers. A young couple looking for their first home. They walked through the rooms with awe, not greed, running their hands along the banister, whispering plans about nurseries and gardens. Felt right. Like the house was waiting for someone who would love it again. I didn't tell them the history. Some stories don't need retelling. Some truths only live in the walls that heard them. The sale moved faster than I expected. Maybe because I didn't fight it. Maybe because I was finally ready to let go. While the paperwork was being processed, I visited the house one last time. I didn't tell Daniel or Claire I was coming. Keys still fit, though the lock felt stiffer, like the house itself was reluctant to open for me. Inside, everything looked different. My curtains were gone. The walls had been painted a pale gray, the kind of color that tries too hard to be elegant. My photographs, all of them, were missing. I wandered from room to room, touching the places that still remembered me. The dent in the hallway from where Daniel had crashed his toy car. The faint mark on the kitchen counter where my husband once spilled coffee and said we'd paint over it someday. We never did. I stood in the living room and whispered to the air, "It's yours now." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. On the table, I left an envelope, not the kind filled with legal threats or confessions. Just a simple letter written in my own hand. I didn't write much. Only this: "You told me to move out, so I did. But you forgot it was never your house to give. Some things are built on love. And love cannot be evicted." Then I locked the door behind me and walked away. The next morning, the house was sold. By evening, the new owners had the keys and the funds were transferred into my account. It was done. Just like that, years of sacrifice, laughter, memories, all condensed into a few signatures and a quiet goodbye. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't need to. By the time he found out, the ink would already be dry. When he finally did call 2 days later, I let it ring until the sound stopped echoing. He called again and again, each time leaving a message that started with anger and ended in disbelief. His voice cracked between words, asking me why, how, what had I done? But there are no answers that can satisfy a heart that never listened until the silence screamed. I didn't delete the messages. I just couldn't bear to hear them. Instead, I went for a walk by the river. The water was dark and slow, moving steadily toward the horizon, carrying everything without resistance. I thought of that as I stood there, how water never argues, yet it always finds its way. And maybe that's what I had done. I had finally stopped arguing with the past. I had let it flow away, taking what it needed. The next day, I packed my things and moved to a small cottage by the coast. Nothing fancy, 2 rooms, a garden, and the sound of waves to keep me company. The first night there, I opened the windows and let the ocean air fill the space. Smelled of salt and new beginnings. I didn't feel joy exactly. What I felt was release, the soft exhale that comes after years of holding your breath. But peace is never free. Comes with its own kind of ache. When I thought of Daniel, I didn't feel hatred. I felt the slow, quiet sorrow of a love that had reached its end. A love that had done its job. I think part of being a mother is learning to love even when it no longer makes sense. To carry warmth in your heart for someone who handed you the cold. But I also learned something else. Love without respect is just servitude dressed in kindness. And I was done serving. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and watched the sunset melt into the sea. The sky burned gold and violet, the kind of colors you only see when something ends beautifully. I thought of my husband again, of his steady hands and quiet wisdom. And I realized he had been with me every step of the way, not in body but in the foresight that saved me when I couldn't save myself. Some people call that luck. I call it love, the kind that builds safety nets long before you know you'll fall. When I closed my eyes, I could almost hear his voice again, gentle as always. "You did right, Mary. You didn't fight them with fire. You fought them with truth." I smiled then, not because I won, but because I finally understood that winning was never the point. The sale made the local paper. A small notice, nothing more. I doubt Daniel even noticed until the moving trucks arrived. But I imagine the look on his face when he saw the sign out front, bold and unfeeling, "Sold." I wasn't there to see it, but I didn't have to be. Some moments you don't need to witness. You just need to know they happened. He sent one last message after that, just 3 words, "How could you?" I read it once and put the phone down. There was no point answering. He wasn't really asking. He was just starting to understand what choices look like when they're no longer his to make. That night, as the waves crashed softly against the rocks outside my window, I whispered to the dark. I didn't take anything that wasn't already mine. And for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming. Because the truth, once spoken, even in silence, becomes its own kind of lullaby. Peace didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, like sunlight filtering through an old lace curtain. First, I kept waiting for the phone to ring again, for Daniel to knock on my door, for someone to tell me I had gone too far. But days turned into weeks, and the silence stayed. And slowly I realized the quiet wasn't punishment. It was freedom. In the early mornings, I'd sit by the window with my tea and watch the tide breathe against the shore. The water was never still, yet it always returned. I envied that constancy. I had spent so many years living for others that I'd forgotten what it felt like to return to myself. Cottage became my sanctuary. I planted lavender by the fence, painted the porch white, and filled the shelves with the books I once loved but never had time to read. There were no footsteps rushing through the hall, no angry voices or slamming doors. Only the rhythm of waves, the ticking of an old clock, and my own heart, steady again. Some nights, I'd find myself thinking of the house I sold. Not with regret, but with tenderness, like one remembers a home from childhood. I imagined the young couple I'd sold it to. I pictured them laughing in the kitchen, maybe fixing the same leaky faucet Daniel always promised to repair. Comforted me to think that the walls might finally echo with love again. But every so often I'd dream of Daniel, not the man he became, but the boy he once was. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions and say they were golden flowers for Mom. Child who believed kindness could fix anything. And in those dreams, I'd want to reach out and tell him, "You were right, my love. Kindness can fix things, but only when it's given to those who deserve it." A few months after the sale, I received a letter, no return address, just my name written in a shaky hand. It was from Daniel. I knew it before I even opened it, the same way a mother knows her child's heartbeat. The words were short, uneven, and tired. He said he'd lost the house, that Claire had left him not long after, taking their daughter with her. He said he finally understood why I had done what I did, that maybe in some way I'd saved him from losing more than bricks and wood. At the end, he wrote, "I wish I'd listened. I wish I'd remembered who you are." I read those lines over and over until they stopped hurting. 'Cause forgiveness, I've learned, doesn't arrive in grand gestures. It's quiet. Seeps into you slowly like morning light. And that night, for the first time since everything happened, I wrote him back. I didn't write much. Just this. "You don't owe me anything, Daniel. Sometimes life needs to break us so we remember how to build again. I hope you find something worth building." I sealed the letter and sent it without waiting for a reply. Some doors need to stay closed, not out of bitterness but out of peace. Years have passed since then. My hair has gone white and my hands are softer now, not from work but from rest. The sea has become my only clock, marking the passage of time with its endless rhythm. I still keep one photograph on the mantel, Daniel as a child laughing in his father's arms. It reminds me that love, in its purest form, never disappears. It just changes shape. It moves from holding on to letting go. Sometimes the neighbors ask if I ever get lonely living by myself. I smile and tell them no. Because loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the absence of peace. And I have plenty of peace now. There's one memory that still visits me sometimes, the day Daniel told me to move out. His voice sharp, his eyes cold like he was talking to a stranger. I remember standing there, holding my breath, waiting for him to take it back. He never did. But now, when I replay that moment in my mind, I no longer feel the sting. Instead, I see it for what it truly was, not an ending but a release. He freed me from a life of waiting to be seen. And in return, I freed him from the illusion that love means obedience. That's the hardest lesson I've ever learned, that even a mother's heart must sometimes choose itself. The sea breeze carries the scent of salt and jasmine tonight. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cries, lonely perhaps, or just calling to the open sky. I've learned to stop reading meaning into every sound. Some things simply are. As I sit here, I think of all the women who've lived their lives in the shadow of sacrifice, who've cooked, cleaned, comforted, and forgiven until there's nothing left but exhaustion and silence. To those women, I want to say this: it's never too late to come home to yourself. Because home isn't made of walls or windows. It's made of peace and the courage to protect it. I keep my husband's wedding ring on a chain around my neck. On hard days, I touch it and remember his favorite saying, "Grace, the world will take what you let it. Don't forget you're part of the world, too." For years, I thought he meant I should fight harder. Now I understand. He meant I should love myself enough to stop fighting for those who don't want peace. So I did. If I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. Not the heartbreak, not the loneliness, not even the silence. Because every wound led me here, to this small house by the sea, to mornings that smell of coffee and salt, to nights filled with nothing but my own breathing. And that's the kind of ending I wish for everyone who's ever been told they're too much, too old, or too inconvenient to love. Because sometimes when someone says move out, they're really just telling you it's time to move on. And when you finally do, you realize you never needed their permission to begin again. So if you're listening to this and your heart feels heavy, remember this: you can lose everything they built around you and still keep what matters most. Your dignity. Your quiet. Your name. Sometimes heartbreak isn't punishment, it's protection. And in that protection, we find something even stronger than love. We find ourselves.